Welcome back everyone to the back ranks.
Maybe we are poor, coolies, trolley pullers, but we are not beggars.
This would be the dialogue a pawn wishes to tell to all the pieces and to the whole world. If you think of a chess color as an army, then it quickly becomes obvious which group the pawns are meant to represent: the infantry. In the early days of chess, players did not know what to do with their pawns. They considered them a nuisance to be get out of the way so that more powerful pieces could join the fray. Beginners make the same mistake. Make sure you don't fall into the same way of thinking. Nowadays, chess masters understand the power of pawns and pawn formation, the pawn structure. Many of our strategic decisions in chess come from the nonsense of pawn structure. Let's look at some of the basic pawn structures. Connected and isolated pawns. Pawns are strong when they are connected, that is, when they stand on adjacent files so that they can protect each other. Isolated pawns. An isolated pawn is the one that have no other friendly pawns on either side to protect it. Take a look at this position. White's pawns are connected together in a pawn chain. The pawn at the head of the chain is protected by its comrades. If the pawns were to advance together as a group, a different pawn could take the lead and still be able to rely on other pawns to protect it. What about black pawn? Black pawns, however, are isolated. No matter how they advance, they can never protect each other. And if white had other pieces on the board, they could pick off black's pawns one by one. Another disadvantage of black's isolated pawn is that white could put a piece on the square in front of them, and black could never be able to use another pawn to chase it away. Isolated pawns are weak, and you should try to avoid them while looking for ways to inflict them on your opponent. Backward pawns. A backward pawn is a pawn that, while technically a connected pawn, has lagged behind his comrades and can safely advance to catch up them. Here, white pawn on e2 is a backward pawn. It can advance without being captured by the pawn on f4. Remember, if the e2 pawn take a leap to e4, it can be captured en passant. Please refer my previous video on initial movements for more information about en passant. I'll be putting a link on description. Note that the black pawn on e5 is not a backward pawn, as it still have the d6 pawn to support it. And the d6 pawn is not backward because it can safely advance. Backward pawns are a lot like isolated pawns. They can be difficult to defend because no other pawns can protect them, and enemy pieces can sit on the square in front of them. Like isolated pawns, they should be avoided. The e5 and e6 pawns are on the same rank. That's called double pawns. Double pawns are two pawns of the same color that occupy the same file. Double pawns are usually weak because the pawn in front blocks the rear pawn from moving. They also cannot protect each other. And the pawns are double and isolated are especially weak. You should take care that you don't let your opponent exchange pieces where you have to recapture by doubling your pawns. It could ruin your pawn structure. Have a look at this position. The black pawns at f6 and f7 are doubled. If this were a middle game position and black were castle kingside, then the double pawns would be a hazard to king safety because of the open g file and weak h6 square. In an endgame, white might be able to slip in and attack the unprotectable h-pawn. On the other hand, if the f6 pawn was on g7, there would be no way for white to penetrate. Let's examine this position. White can ruin the pawn structure of black by bishop into f6, g into f6. Now black has weak double and isolated pawn, which white can attack with knight and rook. Here is how the game might continue. Knight h5. Rook c6, rook f1, king e7. It looks that black has his pawns well enough defended, but white can expand his attack to include the isolated pawn on d5. Rook f5, rook d6, knight f4. Black has too many weak pawns and will now lose one of them. Note, black's isolated pawns are so weak, white could even attack h7 pawn and win it because black can't protect it in time. Pawn islands. At the start of the game, all 8 of your pawns are connected in one long row. As the game goes on, the pawns get exchanged and captured. Gaps start to open up in the pawn line. Each group of connected pawns is called a pawn island, and each isolated pawn is a pawn island by itself, although doubled isolated pawns only count as one pawn island. Take a look at the position on the board. In this position, we see that black has 2 pawn islands and white has 4 pawn islands. This is a big difference, and it means that black pawns will be more coordinated and will have less holes in their structure as the game progresses. In general, the more pawn islands, the more weaknesses. Pawn majority. A pawn majority occurs when you have more pawns on one side of the board than your opponent does. In this position, white has a 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the queen side, and black has a 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the king side. A pawn majority is useful in endgame because it can make a passed pawn. If the white queenside pawns advance and 2 of them are exchanged for black queenside pawns, the remaining white pawn could be a passed pawn. Black could do the same thing on the king side as well. Passed pawn. The white pawn on a5 is a passed pawn because it has no enemy pawns ahead of it, which can stop it advancing. The black pawn on d4 is also a passed pawn. The white pawn on f3 is not a passed pawn because if it were to advance, it could potentially be captured by the black pawn on g5. Likewise, the black pawn on g5 is not a passed pawn because it could be stopped by the white pawn on h3 or the white pawn on f3. Passed pawns are considered as very crucial and very powerful. It can change the equation of a game. Let's enjoy a passed pawn game thriller. This beautiful game was played between Austrian chess master Karl Schlechter and Julius Perlis in 1911. Probably this was an analysis. Karl Schlechter opened the game with the move d4 and Perlis responded with d5. c4 by Schlechter, c6. The Slav defense. Knight f3, knight f6. In move 4, Schlechter plays e3, a quiet move. The main line here is knight c3, and black plays his bishop to f5. Schlechter played his queen out to b3, threatening to capture the pawn at b7. Perlis replies with queen b6, offering a queen trade. Schlechter continued with c take d5, and Perlis went for the queen trade. Schlechter captured the queen with his rook pawn. By going for the queen trade, black is doubling white's pawn, but it serves the white with an open a file for his rook. In this position, black could have simply captured d5 with his knight. But he decided to simplify the position and capture the knight on b1 with his bishop. Instead of capturing the bishop with the rook, Schlechter captured the pawn at c6 with his pawn, threatening the capture of b7 pawn followed by the rook at e8. At this point, if black recaptured the pawn, after rook take bishop, white will have an extra pawn and a good winning chances. To avoid this, Perlis moved his bishop to e4, covering the diagonal. Here, Karl Schlechter unlocked a beautiful tactics to stun his opponent. Pause the video, think and find the best move for white. Let's it go. Schlechter plays rook take a7, the beautiful rook sacrifice. The idea is to deflect the rook from the back rank. Perlis captured the rook with his rook. Then Karl Schlechter made the stunning pawn move c6 to c7. Julius Perlis resigned at this position, as the pawn is unstoppable. It is threatening c take knight to promote to a queen, or else pushing to c8 to change over to a queen. What a beautiful game. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be coming with more instructional videos in coming days. Stay tuned, stay blessed.